A 21-mile strait between southern Iran and the Gulf of Oman is currently deciding whether Asia runs out of oil. Iran controls it. And in the last 48 hours, the Iranians published a policy document explaining, calmly, methodically, in considerable detail, why no military force on Earth can take it from them. The ceasefire technically holds. The global energy crisis does not. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched military operations against Iran. The stated aim was to degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and, in the more candid conversations happening between allies, to trigger the kind of regime collapse that followed in Baghdad in 2003. 40 days later, the Iranian government is intact. Its military is intact. Iran exercises complete control over all of its territory, and crucially, critically, it controls the Strait of Hormuz more tightly than at any point in the Islamic Republic's history. A ceasefire was announced on Tuesday. What has not ended is the fighting in Lebanon, where Israel continues to bomb heavily and Hezbollah continues to resist ground operations south of the Litani River. What has not ended is Iran's grip on the strait. And what has certainly not ended is the global energy shock that began with the opening strikes. Formal U.S.-Iran negotiations were supposed to begin today in Islamabad. J.D. Vance is reportedly there. Whether the Iranian delegation has arrived is genuinely unclear as of this recording. Meanwhile, Russia is methodically extending its positions in eastern Ukraine. An Easter ceasefire has been agreed. After it ends, the offensive resumes. And the world is watching these separate crises and slowly grasping that they are not separate. Let's start with what the Hormuz analysis gets right, because it gets quite a lot right. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply transits the Strait of Hormuz. For Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, China, that figure is closer to 80% of petroleum imports. The Financial Times ran a piece yesterday that barely concealed its alarm. North Sea crude trading well above $97 a barrel. A Biden-era energy advisor, Amos Hochstein, warning that if no diplomatic movement happens in the next few days, markets will conclude the strait is closed indefinitely. When markets conclude something, they price it in. Oil futures reprice. Physically scarce oil is a different problem from expensive oil. It means factories shut down, not just that running costs rise. The mainstream read also correctly identifies the structural nature of Iran's leverage. Unlike the Suez Canal, an artificial waterway, closable by treaty, the Strait of Hormuz is a natural geographic choke point. Iran holds the northern shore. More than 600 kilometers of coastline, strategic islands acting as natural fortifications. There is no viable alternative route, no pipeline bypass, no Panama Canal equivalent. If you are a supertanker carrying Gulf crude to Tokyo or Seoul, you go through Hormuz or you don't go. What Iran has now done is publish, officially, its strategic doctrine on the strait. The document is unambiguous. The Strait of Hormuz is described not as a shipping lane, but as a tool for reshaping the balance of power in the Persian Gulf and globally. Iran intends not merely to monitor the strait, but to exercise, and I'm quoting directly here, absolute, intelligent, and legitimate control. That control includes regulating maritime traffic, collecting passage tolls, and influencing global supply chains in alignment with Iran's interests and those of its regional allies. They use the phrase inexhaustible strategic advantage. The word inexhaustible is doing serious work. They are not describing a temporary bargaining chip. The ceasefire announced Tuesday has held in the narrow sense that American and Iranian forces have not struck each other since. But Iran has made its position on reopening the strait explicitly conditional on what happens in Lebanon. Israel is still bombing Lebanon. Hundreds of civilian casualties reported. Hezbollah continues to resist ground operations south of the Litani River. The Israelis had spoken at various points about occupying all of southern Lebanon up to the Litani. They appear to have quietly dropped that ambition. It hasn't been formally abandoned, but they've stopped talking about it with any conviction, which in geopolitics amounts to the same thing. There are apparently talks scheduled between Israel and the Lebanese government. This is probably the least direct way of communicating with Hezbollah without calling it that, since calling it that would be politically impossible for any Israeli official given a decade of describing Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Indirect diplomatic theater, but theater that might eventually produce something. Iran's condition for any meaningful movement on the strait, the ceasefire must cover Lebanon. Russia's foreign ministry confirmed it agrees. As far as Moscow is concerned, the ceasefire includes Lebanon. The Iranians have Pakistan's support on this position too. The Americans are at a negotiating table in Islamabad from a position they have not occupied in living memory. Weakness. The mainstream analysis tends to treat the Hormuz disruption as a crisis that will be resolved, a temporary shock before normality reasserts itself. This assumption deserves considerably more scrutiny than it currently receives. Consider the Iranian perspective with some clarity. For 40 years, Iran has been the most sanctioned, most economically pressured, most militarily threatened mid-level power in the world. The nuclear deal was negotiated and then abandoned. Sanctions were used as a sustained instrument of economic warfare, and then that campaign was launched against Iranian soil. Iran survived. Not only survived, it emerged holding a lever it has never held so explicitly before: the ability to interrupt global energy supply with no viable military countermeasure. The doctrine published in the last 24 hours says the Iranians understand exactly what they have. They intend to keep it. The question of whether the United States could take it back by force is not simple. Joe Kent, former director of counterterrorism in the Trump administration, made the point recently that even if the U.S. occupied every relevant island and coastline to force Hormuz open, it would then need to garrison those positions indefinitely, facing continuous Iranian retaliation. Permanent boots on the ground, no exit. The American public's appetite for that scenario after Iraq and Afghanistan is precisely zero. The Americans are deploying additional infantry to the region, but it appears to be light infantry, no heavy armor, no sign of the force buildup that a sustained ground campaign against Iran would actually require. Meanwhile, the alliance structures that were supposed to support American power in the region are fracturing in ways that won't repair easily. The Gulf states are not unified. Qatar and Oman are already arguing for accommodation with Iran. Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE are still calling for harder American action. The Saudis, characteristically, are prevaricating. But the fact that the Iranian and Saudi foreign ministers spoke to each other yesterday for the first time since hostilities began says something. It says Riyadh is reading the map. The U.S.-Israel relationship is under strain in ways that will not be acknowledged publicly for some time. Israel appears to have expected this campaign to produce regime collapse in Tehran, analogous to what American power produced in Baghdad in 2003. What it produced instead is a stronger, more strategically confident Iran. Even the Daily Telegraph, arguably the most consistently pro-Israel newspaper in Britain, has published an opinion piece calling for the United States to rein in the Israelis. When the Telegraph says that, the ground has genuinely shifted. Europe is facing an uncomfortable reckoning of its own. The Americans expected their European allies to contribute meaningful military force to the region. They have discovered that European military capability, 3 years of rearmament rhetoric notwithstanding, amounts to very little in practice. The British had been talking until recently about seizing Russian shadow fleet tankers on the high seas. They have now quietly dropped that plan. The Attorney General advised against it. The Admiral Grigorovich frigate made its point simply by existing. Britain cannot challenge Russian naval power in its own nearby waters. That sentence would have seemed extraordinary 20 years ago. It no longer does. Russia, watching all of this with considerable satisfaction, has sent Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, back to Washington. Peskov has been careful to clarify. This is not a Ukraine negotiation. This is bilateral economic discussion. The substance of what Russia will communicate is not difficult to read. The global energy crisis cannot be resolved without Russian oil. Washington has already lifted Russian oil sanctions temporarily. Russia will press for permanent lifting and may hint at the possibility of American investment in Arctic oil reserves, an offer the Kremlin almost certainly doesn't seriously intend, but which communicates unmistakably how dramatically the bargaining position has shifted. 3 things to watch, and one that is being significantly underweighted. The Islamabad talks, if they actually begin, will tell us something important about American political will. Iran's conditions are clear: end the Lebanon fighting and accept permanent Iranian sovereign control of the Strait of Hormuz. On the second point, there is no scenario in which Iran voluntarily surrenders what 40 days of conflict produced. The best realistic outcome is a formalized arrangement under which shipping moves through Hormuz under Iranian supervision and on Iranian terms. That is effectively a toll road through the center of global energy supply, operated by Tehran. It will be described in the language of international agreements. It will nonetheless represent a geopolitical revolution. Ukraine deserves more attention than it is currently receiving against the backdrop of the Middle East crisis. The Easter truce will end. After it ends, Russia intends to intensify. The primary focus is Donbass. The towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk remain the key objective, and Russian forces are positioning to encircle them. In Zaporizhzhia, there are reports of Russian forces breaking through defensive lines around Orikhiv. If Russia reaches the Dnieper in the south and consolidates Donbass, Ukraine faces a strategic crisis that no level of external support, itself diminishing, will resolve. The situation around Sumy in northeastern Ukraine is the thing being underweighted. Russian forces are extending their control at a pace that is only explicable if a serious operation to capture Sumy city is being actively prepared. Sumy controls the main supply routes to Kharkiv. Beyond Sumy, there is a motorway to Kiev with limited natural defensive barriers. Russia attempted this approach in early 2022. The conditions to attempt it again, from a position of significantly greater strength, are assembling. A Ukraine where Russian forces are on the Dnieper in the south, threatening Kharkiv's supply lines from the north, and within operational range of Kiev. That is not a Ukraine whose future is settled. We are probably not looking at decisive events before late summer, early autumn, but we are moving towards them, and moving faster than most Western commentary acknowledges. The third thing, the energy sanctions architecture against Russia is already disintegrating under the pressure of market reality. The Americans have already suspended them once. Russian oil is needed. The case for lifting sanctions entirely is going to be made in Washington, loudly, by people who are not Russia's friends, but who understand arithmetic. This is not a diplomatic victory for Russia. It is Russia collecting what the situation has made inevitable. That decision, to launch military operations against Iran in the midst of what appeared to be functioning diplomatic negotiations, will be studied in strategic programs for decades as a masterclass in how not to use military force. The previous candidate for worst Western strategic decision of the post-Cold War era was the combination of miscalculated NATO expansion and the economic warfare against Russia launched in 2022. That decision triggered deindustrialization across Europe, ruptured the Russia-Europe relationship possibly for a generation, and produced 3 years of attritional warfare that Ukraine is losing. This decision appears to exceed it. What has been achieved? Iran is stronger, not weaker. The dollar's reserve currency status has taken another serious blow. The Financial Times is saying so openly, which means it is no longer a fringe observation. Asian allies of the United States are knocking on Russia's door for oil and China's door for refined products. The Gulf Alliance is fractured. European military weakness has been exposed publicly and will not be forgotten. And Iran now holds and intends to permanently hold the valve controlling a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade. Empires throughout history have started wars they could not afford to finish. The geography changes, the adversary changes, the century changes. The fundamental error, confusing the capacity to start a conflict with the capacity to dictate its conclusion, does not. Iran called it an inexhaustible strategic advantage. 21 miles of water, 40 days of conflict, and a balance of power that has shifted in ways that will take years, possibly decades, to fully work through. We are going to be covering every step of it. If you found this useful, like and subscribe. There's more to come on this. Stay sharp.